All right, we got a hoot today. I don't know what else to call this story. I mean, is it a comedy? Is it a biography? A fictional story? A satire? I don't even know where to begin.
It's hilarious. I was not expecting this at all. I was laughing the entire story. It's on a very mature subject, but delivered in a very juvenile way.
Now I gotta put some disclaimers out there for this talk because it's not like I know really much about this author. I've never read anything by him before. I don't know if there's like a well-known satire behind this. This is going to be like a more like a formalism approach to this, where I'm just reacting to the story. And it also is worth pointing out, I mean, it's translated to English. I have the Wayland Young translation.
Yes, so coming up is Gogol's Wife by Tommaso Landolfi, and it's a hoot. It's something that I was not expecting, but thoroughly enjoyed. And I think there's a lot of levels here. You can go for the almost cheap humor of it, which I think is great. It's done tastefully, I think. But there's also many layers of, I think, some very important subjects that he brings up and addresses.
I'd be curious to see what those are, right? So getting into it. Let's start with the narrator, right? Because whenever I feel like an author starts with this framed narrative, a lot of times I kind of sway towards the unreliableness of the narrator. I guess that's maybe where my mind goes to, having read so much Edgar Allan Poe. But this narrator, who gets a name eventually, like the Foma Pasklovich, foreign name too. I mean, that's not Italian as far as I'm aware. Maybe it's Italian. I could be way off. But he's a biographer, right? So normally a biographer you would really trust, right? Because they go through a school, a system, a process to try to get rid of as much of their personal judgment as possible for normally how they deliver like a narrative, right? But I don't know if I trust this guy.
I don't know. I think that obviously there's always bias. We talk about that as we discuss and argue and go over. You're always going to have your own personal bias. You can't get rid of that. It's impossible, I think. However, the way that this story kind of unfolds, you feel like that Vasilevich is trying to give the benefit of the doubt, especially in the beginning when you really don't know what's going on as a reader. As I got further into the story, I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess he was trying to be PC about it, the way that's how he would label it today. Because this story is nearly 80 years old. But I do see where you're going, that are you sure, is the wife real or not? And that's kind of the crux of the story, right?
I don't know if it's the crux, but I absolutely had that thought, right? Because some of the information in here is real, right? Like Gogol actually never did get married publicly, right? So if the story is about this actual secret he was keeping, like why is he keeping it a secret? What does this narrator have to gain, I guess, in a sense? Let me read this one quote for you. He was no longer so reticent with me, and soon had hardly any secrets left. And this, I may say in parentheses, caused me very great pride. Right. So he's revealing that he gets pride in knowing and being the one to reveal to the world as a biographer this story. So to me, there's like this almost blending of reality tainted with almost kind of like that pale fire problem where you're not sure if you should really trust how it's being delivered, I feel like.
And I think the line that really got me was, quote, Gogol's so-called wife was an ordinary dummy made of thick rubber, naked at all seasons. One, I start laughing. And two, I'm like, wait a minute, what?
Yeah. Well,
is this real or where are we going with this?
Well, I don't know what translation you had. Maybe we had the same one, but mine even comes out and says that it was not a woman, nor an animal, nor plant, but a balloon. Right. And balloon, I don't know how that translated or how Landolfi's original writing was, but that kind of translates to sex doll, right?
Blow-up doll. That's exactly it. I was like, oh my God, this story is about a guy with a blow-up doll. And I just lost it. It's so good.
Yeah. Well, and he would like obsess over her and blow her up, change her shape. And I think that is one thing that we need to kind of discuss is there was painstaking details in how every time she blew up or her hair color changed, eye color changed, stuff like that, she never returned to the past form, right? And I can see rubber, I guess, being malleable like that too, but I felt like there's a bigger point to that, right? Because I guess one of the ways that I took it is if this was a real person, like let's say we don't trust this and it really was a real person, but maybe it was weird or something like that, or hidden away. You know, when we have these traumas, like remember like when Gogol like shoved his fingers down her throat after she said like, I have to go poo poo. Like, but like it changed her so that she was never the same. But isn't that also potentially like a metaphor for trauma? Like when someone's abused or when someone goes through something, they can never be the person they once were. Their shape, their personality changes sometimes.
I think there's a couple of different ways to take this. If it really is a real person, then we do change. You and I talk about this. I feel like every single video now of how we're getting older, and we got the snap crackle pops and got gray in my beard. You do have moles in new places. You're like, what? Where's that spot? I haven't seen that spot before. You know, I've been staring at this arm for 45 years and that spot was never there. So yeah, it does feel like that it could be an exaggeration of somebody physically getting older and changing. And then to your point of the trauma of this, of whose trauma is it, right? Is it the wife or the husband's here? Whose trauma are we looking at in the story?
I'm going to blend interpretations here, but I feel I'm going to go with Gogol's trauma. Maybe you have a different opinion, but I think I'm blending things here. Because remember when they talked about the blow-up doll having a venereal disease? And it's like Gogol blames the blow-up doll. It's like, well, if it is a blow-up doll, it ain't getting no venereal disease from anyone but you, Sir Gogol. So that is part for how I read that, is him blaming the blow-up doll for his own mistakes, his own trauma, his own shortcomings. Like he's projecting that onto this inanimate object.
And that's where I feel like this story has a lot of great levels, because you could think about it of how do we mask our trauma? How do we deal with our trauma? And if this is a blending of realities of Gogol, did he have some type of traumatic event that influenced him later and gave him some type of, mental disorder? I don't know, but that definitely seems to kind of what is being alluded to here.
So syphilis, right, is that common at this time period?
Oh yes, especially in the fun houses, the brothels.
Right. And I think it's interesting that he calls the Caracas like the capital of Venezuela, right? And they call it out like in the narrative this. But he almost, to the point of projection, creates her in some way. Like it kind of reminds me from like the biblical standpoint, like, like God breathed life into his creation, man. The way that we describe the skeleton whalebone and the teeth. Let me just read this. And that, I think, exhausts the description of the most noteworthy peculiarities of this being. Unless, perhaps, I should mention the splendid rows of white teeth, which adorned her mouth, and the dark eyes, which, in spite of their mobility, perfectly simulated life. Did I say simulate? Good heavens. Simulate is not the right word. Nothing seems to be the word when one is speaking of Caracas. So the way that he is breathing, giving life to her, that he gives her his name, he names her, right? It's almost like the, remember the Clarice Lispector story that we talked about where God names his creation? There's a lot of creation elements of, and I don't even think it has to be biblical or religious. I think it can also be artistic, right? When you create something in this world, a book in the case of Gogol, right? And you put it out into the world, that, from a point of view, it's no longer your creation. People are going to react to it and think differently of it. And it's almost like you let go. It becomes something else, but you still are the creator of that in some regards.
You always go so with the good explanations, and I always go to the horrible part of human nature. Because if you look at the title of this story, it's Gogol's wife with an apostrophe S, ownership. And I feel like if you love somebody, I wouldn't have named it that. I would have named it my wife's name. It would have been Mary Jane's story, or, Alice's story. And instead it's Gogol's wife, the ownership of one. I think there is an argument to be made of how people perceived women during this time period and how they were treated as well. And there's a quote from the story. It says, "Sometimes he would even blame himself in quite absurd manner. He was always prone to self-accusation. He's always looking internally that this is all about himself and not about her. Whether she's real or not, I feel like in this story being represented as a little bit of kind of a narcissist."
Okay. What if I'm trying to bring, I got to bring it back to the positive. You're going to challenging me here.
Right.
What if we look at it this way? You create a book, and you're right. Once you let it go, it's no longer yours. But let's talk about the editing phase, right? The way that Gogol labored over her, changing her, right? The way that you labor over a book, trying to get it to be perfect. Now, you and I read, going back to the earlier point about this blending like fiction and reality and such. Remember when we read Dead Souls, it's not technically a complete work, right? Do you remember why?
Yeah, he doesn't finish it. And we lost the manuscripts of part 2 because he destroyed them. Dang you, Gogol.
Well, and to that point in the story, there's that part where he goes crazy and he's throwing stuff in the fire, the pyre of vanities, right? Yep. And the little I do know about Gogol is, a lot of his political aspirations, his which way he swung in terms of politics changed greatly at the end of his life. And there's speculation over the influences to that and such, and I'll leave that to the biographers to tell that better. But you see the way that even the Gogol in the story, in terms of the blending the fiction and reality, also kind of starts to switch his stance and change his opinion on things and starts to go mad with this obsession of creating the perfect thing. In the same way that the Gogol of real life went mad and changed political obsessions and from conservatism and such, and even threw his manuscript in the fire. Like, it's kind of interesting to see the obsession come from the within, because he's projecting upon the doll, if we take the story at face value, at least.
And he's projecting upon the biographer as well. I mean, there's a part towards the end of the story of that he's like, him too, like he's in on this. And it's almost like there's this mass hysteria, or that they're allowing each other to feed on their own misnomers or their own lies, and they're perpetuating each other's lies by, their friendship. Because I almost feel like there's a friendship here, and there's like, well, if you lie to me, I'll lie to you, and we'll both be happy in the end.
Okay, so let me ask 2 questions, which I'm not sure there's an answer, but let me just hit you with this. There was a specific point in the text where they point out that he crossed with his left hand, right? And from our discussions with Dostoevsky, in terms of the Lord separating the sheep from the goats, putting the faithful on the right, that the right is always like the sign of the faithful, the sign of the correct, and you always cross with your right hand.
Yep.
Right? And Gogol, well, I guess, at a time from orthodoxy later in his life, you would always cross with your right hand, is my understanding. Use the 3 fingers, right, to represent the Trinity, and the 2 representing like the fallen nature of man, I think. Yeah, okay. Beside that point, why point out that they used his left hand to get more to the point?
Oof. I guess that I want to say he was the devil, or maybe he was a sinner. Maybe he wasn't, what's the word I'm looking for? That he wasn't genuine about it. It was not done in good faith. Possibly.
Well, he wasn't faithful, right? Because the left hand was for the unfaithful. So who's being unfaithful? Where'd that syphilis come from, right? Might be one question. Where did his lack of inspiration for his creativity come from? For why he had to burn the pyre of vanities? And why did Caracas have a baby, right? Like those are somehow connected in like kind of like this wild ending where he throws something into the fire that also appears to be Caracas's baby, right? So when it comes to the question of unfaithful, how do we interpret that?
That's a tough question. Again, as I said, there's a lot of layers to this story. There's so many elements that I feel like are blending, as we've said, reality and this story. What is truth? What is not? What's believable? What's not? I think that in itself is the story of you don't know what to believe, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think I had a strong interpretation as to what exactly that could be. You know, like if we take the literary interpretation that we were discussing, well, sometimes when you give birth to things, like you have like the Stephen King approach where he just kind of wrote whatever came to him, right? And then you had others that had like lay out the roadmaps and decide, okay, this is what's going to beget that, and I'm going to write exactly 3 books to tell the story, right? You have, is she real? Okay, well then you have a question of, is he like willing to get rid of all of his shame, right, of the past, which includes infanticide of some sort here apparently. And then there's the interpretation of it's a balloon. Well, balloons can't have babies. Like that's not a thing. It's a blow-up doll. So what is the madness in this situation where you assume that it actually was a blow-up doll, right? Like it's kind of crazy to think about like what could this mean?
There's definitely an uncertainty to this story, and I hope that it's not true.
Well, Gogol will always hold a special place in my heart, regardless of his opinion of rubber blow-up dolls, which I actually looked up. Like, I was like, when did those get invented? And there's literally, dude, there's a Wikipedia page on this that talks about
oh Lord,
the first documented form of it being from a French newspaper from the 1855 World's Fair. Which is before the story was published. It's just crazy. That's just crazy to me. So I mean, and there's some like I think when I was trying to like date it, like there's some references here to 1908. There's a quote here from Ewan Block. I'll maybe I don't want the doll.
Don't put those links. Don't put those links.
Yeah, that's probably not a good link.
No,
yeah.
No.
You're going to have to Google that one. I think you can find
pervs.
it though. Can you imagine like you didn't even start this? Because some people will watch our videos not having read the story, being like, okay, well, do I want to read this? Can you imagine like going into the link section and being like, what the hell is this?
What did Crypto and Una get us into? Oh, Lordy.
This channel changed drastically since their last video. Goodness.
What happened? We got a sponsorship, by Trojan. So
got spicy real quick. All right, guys. Well, apparently this is our version of the OF factory here. So thank you for spending time with us today. My name's Ben Una. I appreciate you spending time. Peace.
Peace.